When I wake, I actually dream about what's possible with food. I don't think there's enough hours in the day to do all the things that I want to do.
For most of us, that's all they are, dreams. But Adam isn't burdened by what you and I see as obstacles. Impossible is just an equation he hasn't solved yet. And it's that open conduit between the dream and its execution that's taking the Milawa Co family, the Northeast Victorian collection of businesses Adam owns along with his wife Flo, on one of the most ambitious trajectories, yet the idea itself has been around almost forever.
For COVID particularly, that's what excites me about the next 10 or 20 years, is making our local food system a lot more sustainable and not being so reliant on stuff coming from further afield. As a baker, when I first started baking and not having a baking background but a chef background, one of the most frustrating things is that my chefing background was chefing from scratch. But as a baker, the first thing I saw from an Australian modern baking point of view was that everything come in a bag. There was a lot of pre-mixes, there was no contact with our raw ingredients, and I suppose that's where I fell in love with that idea or dream that I wanted to find out more about the baking process and the techniques and how to do this from scratch. Milawa bread has grown around a philosophy of using the least amount of ingredients and high quality. Flour, water, salt, natural culture. That's all sourdoughs are.
So it makes sense then, if you're using the fewest amount of ingredients possible, that each and every one is critical. And in an industry that's used to receiving that most fundamental ingredient, flour, already milled, with no mention of its regionality, much less which variety of wheat or rye it might have come from, the next step for Adam and Flo was clear.
The reason that we chose to mill our own flour was to initially give us that connection to our product. But ultimately it's turned into our ability to have access to highly densely nutritional flour. So our stone milling here at Milawa, we're doing two types of flour. We're doing whole grain flour. That's every ounce that goes in the top of the mill and comes out is accessible to us as bakers. So that's the wheat germ, that's the endosperm, the oils, everything. That's everything in and everything out. We don't take anything out. And then we've got our lightly sifted high extraction flour. So all we're taking out of that is the bran, but it's still still nutritionally dense. So we're not doing roller milled flours. From a baking point of view, yes, they're harder to work with, but that's also part of the skill and the challenge that we're prepared to work with. But the reason that the industry uses roller milled flour is that it's easy to work with from a commercial point of view. It's shelf stable forever and ever. It doesn't go off. They've taken all of the oils and all the good bits out of it. I think we need to start looking at flour as a fresh product, like a carrot. Like milk, like cheese. That would be my dream over the next 5 or 10 years, is that when we start talking about flour, it's not something that we put into the cupboard to leave in there for 6 and 12 months. I think we should be buying a flour weekly or monthly. Freshly milled flour has got a shelf life, 3 to 6 months.
Their stone mills, handmade in France, arrived late March just as virus lockdowns were freezing overseas travel, and panic buying saw supermarkets stripped of essentials like toilet paper and flour.
Within hours. We couldn't have actually planned. I think if we had planned it, it would have taken longer. I think as soon as they were plugged in, we were actually selling flour the next day to the local community. And I think that's pretty special.
Milling grain into flour on site was a huge step forward in terms of the freshness, nutrients and flavour of the flour that they used. But like a winery that had to buy in their own grapes, Adam could see that there was one last piece in the provenance of their flour still to be explored, and that was the grain itself.
I was telling him about, that we were getting flour mills, and, I had this dream of planting wheat one day. He goes, I've got a paddock, that we could probably do something with. And it was just a 6 or 8 month conversation and journey. And then finding out that, he's got an agronomy background. So that was a really important connection for me with Andrew, and having that willingness from him as well to connect the dots. For planting for milling, we've planted oats, we've planted wheat, both winter wheat and red wheat. We've also planted rye, huge fan of rye. We've planted durum for our pasta making in-house, which is exciting. Paddock to stone mills to pasta. But we've also, what's most exciting is that we've got the trial plots going in. So we've got 60 varieties of wheat that we've been lucky enough to access from the New South Wales Grain Department, Ag Department, or Grain Research Department. And we'll have a look at those over the next couple of years, so we'll grow those out from small plots. Yeah, and I think that's the ultimate goal going forward. I think with the new, I don't think it's a new bread revolution, but I think it's one that we're going back to. I think it's exciting that we can start talking about the flavour of flour and grain profiles is exciting. Probably one of the most exciting times for bread making across the world. People are actually putting more emphasis on where their ingredients come from, particularly from a bread making point of view, where the grain comes from. Bakers are now starting to talk about grain varietals. We're talking about who grew them. I think that's exciting. I think it's a must going forwards. I think it's connecting that whole sustainable food system, knowing who's growing your products. I think it then opens us up into a new realm. Is the wheat that I grow here, just down the road from Milawa, it is going to be different to the wheat that's grown in Queensland. It's going to be different to the wheat that's grown in South Australia. We could be growing the same varieties, but we start looking at different GIs, like in the wine industry. I think that's super exciting, being a winemaker, that suddenly we start thinking differently about a loaf of bread. Yeah, absolutely.
It's clear that underlying this passion to create food from its source ingredients, all grown and made locally, is that the skills to create them are as important as the products themselves. So passing this on is key. Community and people.
Being self-reliant, but it's still, all of that food is based on skills and knowledge. I think it's probably one of the things that's been lost in the whole communication over the last couple of decades with food. We talk about organic and biodynamic, and we talk about food, but we don't always talk about the skills and where they've come from and how important they are. 98 was when I got the Queen's Trust grant. Our charter was to send young Australians overseas and to immerse, to study, and to bring those skills back. I think it's really important for our staff. Having that connection to where it's grown, to where our food comes from, how it's processed. I think it gives all of us a sense of purpose.
Bring it home, bring it home. It's about the end and the beginning. about the hands, the underpinning. Bring it home, bring it home. I don't wanna win if someone loses. If we get it right, everyone chooses.
We used to grow grain. We used to grow rye and wheat and oats. We think there's an importance to go back to that.